Good morning, 8th grade. Mr. Franklin here. It is Tuesday, May 26, 2020, and today we're going to be talking about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. We are entering our last week of school, so it is super imperative that you complete 100% of your work this week. Coming up this Friday will be our homeroom celebrations on Zoom, so make sure you are there and ready to participate. There's going to be a lot of special activities taking place. Your parents will be contacted this week in order to discuss dropping off your promotion materials for those of you who are being promoted. Hopefully you don't have to go to summer school. Ooh. So I want to see 100% completion in all the homerooms. Today we're going to be talking about a pretty tragic event. I really think you need to watch the video so you can get the full effect of it. But you're going to listen to Mr. Franklin's presentation and you're going to do some reading. You're going to answer some questions about primary and secondary sources. I want to make sure you're going into high school knowing the difference. And then I want you to watch the supplemental material, which is the video on the 16th Street Baptist Church. Let's go ahead and go into our presentation on the 16th Street Baptist Church. So, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing took place in the city of Birmingham. The city of Birmingham was the most segregated city in the South in the United States. It was known as Bombingham. It was known as Bombingham because over 50 unsolved home and church bombings had taken place between the end of World War II and the 1960s. These bombings were propagated by the KKK. This racist gentleman right here named Bull Connor, he was sort of the police chief. He was labeled the head of public safety in Birmingham, and he essentially did everything he could to stop African Americans from organizing and getting their rights. There were lots of protests that took place in Birmingham. Lots of protests for people who wanted to have the right to vote. Essentially, in the South, black people obviously were legally allowed to vote, but various means were employed in order to stop them from voting. So in the early 1960s, the black community started protesting in large numbers, and the famous scenes of fire hoses being turned on black people, that was Bull Connor who authorized that. So Birmingham was super segregated, small southern town where African Americans were denied their rights, and then also any protests that African Americans participated in were met with huge amounts of violence. He told the fire department to turn the hoses on protesters in order to disperse them, allowed attack dogs to attack black protesters. The protests there were famous because at one point the African American community decided that young school children were going to participate in protests. So there you have videos of the powers that be, the white community, jailing black children for protesting for their rights. And so it really highlighted the evil of segregation in Birmingham. All of that was intentional. Obviously, having the jailhouses full of school-age children shows how evil the system was. So what was the bombing? The bombing was a direct response to school integration. Now, I want you to remember that in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education was passed. So Brown wasn't passed, it occurred. Remember that 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education was a Supreme Court case that said segregation in schools was unconstitutional. All right, it violated the 14th Amendment, which meant in 1954, the Supreme Court said all public schools have to be desegregated. They have to be integrated. Think about this. 1963, Birmingham schools were still segregated. There were white schools and black schools. That is how long it took for white communities to actually follow Brown versus the Board of Education. And the federal government was putting pressure on Birmingham to integrate their schools that fall. And the KKK was not happy. So they decided they were going to essentially have a first few class funerals, which is what the governor of Alabama said needed to happen to stop this integration. So the KKK planted a bomb outside of the 16th Street Baptist Church. The 16th Street Baptist Church was a church in Birmingham that was used all throughout the civil rights movement in order to hold rallies and protests. It was sort of like the center of black protest in Birmingham. That morning, 4 young girls were getting ready they had just had Bible study, and they were getting ready for their choir. So they were in the restroom, sort of putting their choir clothes on, when the bomb went off that morning, and it killed all 4 of them. 4 men were suspected of this killing. The city exploded. Birmingham exploded that night. There were riots, and there were other deaths. There were like 2 other deaths that day because of the riots that took place because of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. So again, the KKK was angry that the federal government was forcing integration in the public schools, the public elementary schools, and so they decided that they were going to be violent to sort of show black people that they're not going to accept integration, and to scare the black community away from integration. And it had the opposite effect. It outraged the entire country. So it's one of those things that's so evil that people who are on the fence, people who don't care about the civil rights movement, are forced to sort of wake up and see when these 4 young girls were killed that day. So what were the effects of the bombing? So it led to rioting and violence in Birmingham. It outraged the nation. It rejuvenated the civil rights movement. It contributed to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is super important because what it did was it outlawed segregation in public places. So these lunch counters where the sit-ins are, that's no longer legal. Restaurants can no longer be segregated. Stores can no longer be segregated. Churches can no longer be segregated. Anything that is public, any private store, any private restaurant can no longer be segregated. So the difference is that you have public and private. All right? So something that is public is like a park, right? It's a government run. That was already illegal to segregate. But the Civil Rights Act said that anything where people can come in general, even if it's a private store or restaurant, cannot be segregated. So that was super important. I want to talk about one thing because you're going to need this for high school. I need you to know the difference between primary and secondary sources. You're going to answer some questions on today's Google form that are going to help you think about primary and secondary sources. A primary source is anything that existed at the time. So an eyewitness account, a historical artifact, historical footage. So if it was there, made at the time, or it is based upon the testimony of somebody who was there, that is a primary source. So an example would be a speech given by Martin Luther King Jr. That is a historical artifact. It was made at the time. That's a primary source. If it is some video footage of the damage done, if it is a piece of the 16th Street Baptist Church, that is all primary source. If it is an interview with somebody who was there during the bombing, that is a primary source. All of our history is based upon learning about primary sources. Secondary source, however, is based off of primary source. So a web page about the 16th Street Baptist Church, an article that you read about the 16th Street Baptist Church, an encyclopedia article, a textbook, those are all secondary sources. It's factual information based off of primary sources. So that's what you need to know about primary and secondary sources. All right. So, guys, today's lesson is pretty interesting. I want you to watch the history of the 16th Street Baptist Church, how it went down, how the men who did it were eventually caught and brought to justice, how long it took years and years and years, and the legacy of the 16th Street Baptist Church. All right. All right, so I love you guys. I want you to stay safe. I want you to complete all your work 100% today. It's not hard. You can do it. And I will catch you on the flip side.